I'd like to address the question of whether Zionism is colonialism and what would be the implications either way. First of all, I think that a lot of people deeply misunderstand what is being asserted when the claim is made that Zionism is best understood as a colonial project. You would often hear Zionist apologists say that Jews cannot be colonizers in the land between the river and the sea for the simple fact that they are the descendants of a once great civilization that has existed in that land. If anything, they are the true indigenous people returning home at last. By the way, I used to believe this very much myself. Today, I don't find this to be very convincing. It's not so much that the argument is false, it's rather that it misses the point. The phenomenon of colonialism, properly understood, has nothing to do with the question of whose land a certain land is. The question of whose land is a very problematic question. It might even be nonsensical. I mean, since the dawn of the human species, human beings have roamed the face of the earth several times over. Certainly in Africa and Eurasia, and certainly in the land bridging between these continents. The ancient kingdom of Judea is only one out of many, many cultures that have succeeded each other in that land since deep prehistory all the way down to our time. In fact, that Judean kingdom, according to its own tradition, was founded by a coalition of foreign tribes who exterminated and enslaved the previous inhabitants of the land. Furthermore, it is by no means clear that modern-day European Jews are more the descendants of those ancient Judeans than, say, the Palestinian Falahin, by which I mean the Arab Muslim peasants that the early Zionists encountered in the land, mostly in its mountainous region. These Falahin may well have been the descendants of ancient Judean peasants, known in Jewish tradition as Am Haaretz, which means people of the land, who possibly, unlike the urban elites, remained in place after the destruction of the Judean polity and continued to till the land generation after generation, adopting along the way the Arab language and the religion of Islam. This was, by the way, a theory accepted at one time by Zionists, among them Ber Borochov, Yitzhak ben Tzvi, and David ben Gurion. But even if we ignored such complications, and even if we accepted that modern European Jews are the only rightful heirs of the ancient kingdom of Judea, even then, who's to say that property rights are transferable across so many generations while being absent from the land? Maybe not. The point is that once you start testing the narrative, once you start to honestly and critically examine the Zionist historical claim to the land between the river and the sea, you find that there is some historical substance in that story, but also a lot of ambiguity, controversy, and in short, ideology in choosing to paint history in this particular manner. But in any case, the theory of colonialism, properly understood, doesn't even dip its toes in these muddy waters. It doesn't ask the question of whose land. When we differentiate between colonizer and colonized, we do not do so on the basis of the questionable idea that there is such a thing as the rightful, natural inhabitants of a certain piece of land. When we differentiate between colonizer and colonized, we simply acknowledge a certain pattern in history, a kind of asymmetrical relationship between human groups that bears striking similarities wherever this relationship appears, whether we are looking at North America in the 18th century or Palestine in the 20th century. And it is this historical pattern that I would like to explore in more detail right now. Now, to be more exact, I'm going to talk not simply about colonialism, but about modern capitalist settler colonialism. This is not because there are no other forms of colonialism, it's just that this kind of colonialism has its own unique characteristics, and it has had incomparable significance in shaping the world we live in today, and it is this kind of colonialism most pertinent to the Zionist case. So let's look at that. So what is modern capitalist settler colonialism? Well, this is a certain pattern in modern history where we see a surplus population within the capitalist world coming under pressure, socioeconomic pressure, political pressure to exit the boundaries of that world and to venture out into the as of yet non-capitalist parts of the planet. The settlers usually do this, at least initially, with the backing of an already existing capitalist state, which acts as a metropole to the colony. Though the settlers may very well outgrow this dependency and eventually fight for independence, probably in order to go forward with colonization with full force. Now, the settlers in their area of settlement inevitably encounter other human beings. I mean, since prehistory, wherever on Earth there has been flora and fauna, there has existed some human population sustaining itself through that flora and fauna. Now, whether the people encountered by the settlers are the original inhabitants of the land, whatever that means, is not important to our story. The important point is that at the time of colonization, the people inhabiting the land and making use of its resources do so in an unproblematic manner. They just live there, perhaps for generations, unaware that their existence or way of life should be contested by anyone. But this changes, of course, with the arrival of the first settlers. This is not to say that the local population never had experience with another human group appearing in their area and wishing to also make use of the resources, which may then be negotiated in one way or another, peacefully or with force. But with the arrival of the settlers, it's a different story altogether. Modern capitalist settler colonialism poses a unique and total threat to the local inhabitants' way of life and even to their very existence. You see, the settlers bring with them very strange practices. They enclose the land with fences. They engage in intensive agriculture. They commercialize all social relations. And eventually they industrialize. And in so doing, the settlers radically clash with the local population over the issue of the distribution and use of local resources, most notably land. The goal of the settlers is to liberate land, a precious resource, from an unproductive population, so as to allow the establishment of a rational, flourishing society, which is to say a capitalist society that will be owned by themselves and that will completely change the face of the entire land. And in order to legitimize this usurpation against existing property relations, the settlers come armed with a certain ideology, with a certain theory of private property. This was very much the philosophical project of John Locke, the 17th century Englishman who was invested in the colonization of North America. According to Locke's theory, private property, by which we mean an exclusive right to make use of a certain resource, comes about when, for example, a certain piece of land is first put to use in a process of production for profit. So you see, according to this theory, and very conveniently for the settlers, the fact that a given land is already sustaining the existence of another human population is irrelevant if this is brought about in a primitive and wasteful manner. In other words, if a given land has yet to be subjected to a capitalist mode of production, it is to be seen as empty, virgin soil. And so the settlers see the local inhabitants not so much as human beings worthy of property rights, but rather as merely an aspect of the natural scenery. They expect them to simply give way in the face of civilization, and eventually to wither away along with the wild forests and the wild beasts. However, very soon the local inhabitants do assert their humanity by resisting the settlers' appropriation of natural resources, and so a conflict develops. At first, perhaps a family of settlers builds a fence around some piece of land, not knowing that it has been used as a common ground for hunting or for grazing. The local inhabitants then either dispute the settlers' claim to have absolute and exclusive dominion over that piece of land, or perhaps they don't even understand this strange concept of private property. And so they simply ignore the sign and carelessly venture into the enclosed land in order to hunt or to graze. Now, the settlers, of course, are outraged at the sight of this transgression, and they punish the thieves, who then retaliate in kind. And so gradually, what begins as local and sporadic property disputes coalesces into a clash of civilizations, a struggle between two human communities with radically different approaches to the question of property, each seeing the other as a transgressor and more as an existential threat. Each group tries to eliminate the other's troublesome presence in the area, either by exemplary violence meant to instill fear or terror, or by systematically attacking the very conditions of life of the rival community, destroying homes, burning crops, slaughtering farm animals, as well as slaughtering the people themselves. The war is total and the violence is indiscriminate, which means that women, children, and the elderly compose the majority of the victims on both sides. Yet the settlers don't see this violence as a symptom of a tragic relationship which they have had a part in creating. Rather, they see the violence of the local inhabitants as an expression of their evil essence. Thomas Jefferson, for example, referring to the Native Americans, wrote of, quote, "the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." So you see, the settlers go from ignoring the political significance of the local inhabitants to seeing them as absolute devils. And this then serves as yet another justification for the settler-colonial project. The settlers' takeover of resources is portrayed as a just punishment against a murderous race of people, despite the fact that in reality the settlers' violence against the local inhabitants is far more destructive and lethal, and may very well reach the level of genocide. Paradoxically, local resistance is seen as aggression, while foreign conquest is seen as defense. Now, I don't want to demonize the settlers. We wouldn't be doing justice to the complexity and the tragedy of history if we didn't try to find empathy to all characters in our story. And indeed, the settlers are very much themselves the victims of the historical role that they have taken upon themselves, initially unsuspecting the full implications of this settler project. As they see it, they are the underdog. I mean, they are initially propertyless people who very traumatically leave their place of birth behind and venture into an unknown land with a beautiful dream of freedom and prosperity. Initially, it is not clear that they are the superior power in the land. At first, the demographic advantage of the local inhabitants, as well as their knowledge of the land, allows them to inflict devastating harm on the settlers, who are understandably fearful for their survival. Only with time, the settlers become more powerful through their technological and organizational capital, as well as through the support of a metropole state. They inevitably see this increasing power and their victories as a confirmation of their virtues and as a reward for their sacrifice. And they inevitably learn to see the oppression or even the destruction of their fierce enemies as a necessary condition for their own existence and way of life. Now, if you look at the history of the Zionist project in the land between the river and the sea, you find this pattern of relationship exactly between Zionists and Palestinians since the end of the 19th century until today. The Zionist case fits this pattern to a T. After all, Zionism began when a surplus population of sorts within the capitalist world came under pressure to exit that world, in this case the Jewish population of Europe, especially in East Europe, where Jews were mostly amassed. Then came the idea that this impoverished and therefore troublesome mass of people should be converted into industrious, useful settlers in Palestine, or possibly in South America or in East Africa. The Zionist project was consciously and proudly modeled on such precedents as the English colonization of North America, as well as the Prussian colonization of hitherto Slavic territories. In Palestine, Zionist settlers quickly ran into disputes with the local inhabitants, mainly because of radically different understandings of property rights. Although the purchase of land with cash had already existed in Ottoman Palestine, this was not seen as absolute private property. That is, when a piece of land was sold by one wealthy landowner to another, the poor peasants tilling the land, whatever their official status, were seen as also possessing property in the land in virtue of their labor being invested in it, so that they were not kicked off by the new owner. They were only asked to pay him his due as the new landlord. The Zionists, however, since the very first colonies, or moshavot, would buy land in Palestine and then try to kick the peasants off. Another kind of property dispute would arise when local inhabitants would gather fruits or draw water or graze their flock on what they considered to be common grounds for such uses, whereas the new Zionist owners of the land would punish them as thieves. Now, for a while, such property disputes were mitigated by the fact that the early Jewish moshavot would hire Arabs as agricultural wage workers, so that the moshavot at least supplied jobs to the displaced Palestinian peasants and to Palestinians in general. This allowed for some unequal coexistence and even cultural mixing in the moshavot. Yet the employment of Arabs in the moshavot posed a serious problem to the Zionist cause. You see, when more and more Jews without property began arriving at the beginning of the 20th century, these proletariat Jews found that they were unable to find work in the Jewish colonies of Palestine because the employment of Arab workers was far more profitable to the moshavot. Indeed, a huge percentage of Jews who arrived in Palestine in those days found that they cannot compete with Arabs in the labor market and left the land never to return. It was quickly understood that if this kind of colonization continues, that is, a colonization that relies on local Arab labor, it would be impossible to absorb millions of propertyless East European Jews, and the society created in Palestine would be one where capital would be Jewish, yet labor would be Arab, which is to say it would still be a society with an Arab majority. And so new strategies of colonization were developed. Firstly, there was a campaign to prevent the employment of Arabs by Jewish capital. This was done through pressure and violence. Secondly, proletariat Zionists began to organize themselves in collective settlements, sometimes known as kibbutzim, with the help of capital furnished to them by Central European bourgeois Zionists. In these collective settlements, young men and women lived a Spartan lifestyle and shared the difficult work, which allowed them to survive the challenging first years of settlement. The kibbutzim were also exclusively Jewish, so this helped to deal with the threat of Arab labor. The point is that the Zionist movement did its best to create in Palestine a new economy that was to be expanded over as much of the territory as possible and to be kept as exclusively Jewish as possible. This means that Palestinians were not even facing the threat of proletarization under Jewish capital, but rather were facing complete alienation from the land. And at the very same time, Arab intellectuals began translating Zionist literature, where it was openly professed that the goal of Zionism was to take over all the land and all the industry and to create a state whose chief priority would be not the freedom and happiness of all the inhabitants presently existing in the land, but rather the absorption of many millions of land-hungry Jews from East Europe. And so what began as local, sporadic property disputes coalesced into an existential struggle. Then, in 1918, the British took over the country and they supported, to a significant degree, Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchase. Under the British, Zionists were also allowed to create autonomous institutions, a kind of state in the making, while the Palestinians were only allowed religious, sectorial, reactionary representation. The Palestinians filed petitions and organized demonstrations. They clearly expressed that they are not given consent to Zionist colonization, but this failed to change the course of things. Eventually, they realized that their only chance of blocking Zionist colonization would be to take political control of the land. They set their sights on establishing a national representative government that would reflect the concerns and wishes of the people of the land, then still overwhelmingly non-Zionists, which is to say, they campaigned for immediate self-determination. They wanted democracy. And as this was being denied by the British, a rebellion broke out in the late 1930s. This rebellion included not just a general strike and demonstrations, but also guerrilla warfare against the British administration and the Jewish community. Facing this threat, the Jewish community began to undergo militarization with the help and guidance of the British. They learned from the British how to counter guerrilla warfare as well as how to smash a popular uprising. However, as the British were increasingly occupied with the threat of a rising rival empire in Nazi Germany, they decided that in Palestine, the violent enforcement of Zionism was becoming too costly. They announced in 1939 a new policy aimed at the establishment of a single democratic state in Palestine in a few years' time. By now, however, the Zionist project in Palestine was strong enough to part ways with its metropole. After World War II, Zionist militias rebelled against the British administration in Palestine, and the British eventually announced that they are departing from the land. The newly founded United Nations was now to decide the fate of the land between the river and the sea. And so in November 1947, the UN adopted a plan for Palestine that was called partition. Yet this wasn't so much a plan of partition as it was a plan of Zionist expansion. You see, this plan called for the expansion of Zionist control in Palestine from 6% of the total territory to 55%. Some 500,000 Arabs and their property were to fall under the control of land-hungry Zionist institutions. Moreover, these Zionist institutions would become a sovereign state, which means that the Zionists would be free to open the gates for millions of Jewish immigrants to amass within Palestine. Furthermore, they will be able to turn their militias into powerful, regular armed forces. One Palestinian leader predicted that the Zionists would, quote, establish a giant air force and build atomic weapons with which to overawe the Arab world. It's also important to understand that it was by no means clear that partition would be the end of Zionist expansion. Already in 1937, David Ben-Gurion explained that, quote, a partial state isn't the end but rather the beginning. Every growth in our power helps us to acquire the entire land. The establishment of a state, even if partial, will be used as a powerful lever in our historical efforts to redeem the land in its entirety. The Palestinian leadership turned down this UN plan of Zionist expansion. Instead, they insisted on the establishment of a single democratic state that would allow Palestinians to defend their property and their way of life from the encroachments of Zionism. It was decided to resist the implementation of the UN plan with political pressure as well as with force. By the way, revisionist Zionists, who today rule the State of Israel, also turned down the 1947 UN plan because they demanded and acted to forcefully take the entire land immediately. In any case, the Palestinian society, materially speaking, was no match to the Zionist state in the making. For a few months, Jews and Arabs exchanged blows. Both sides blew up bombs in public places and committed massacres. But after receiving a huge delivery of weapons from Czechoslovakia by courtesy of Stalin, the Zionist militias overran the Palestinians from the beginning of April 1948. From this point forward, the war was becoming completely one-sided. Palestinian society was in total collapse. It was rendered defenseless. Only at this late stage of the war and after Palestinian refugees had already begun to appear in neighboring Arab countries with testimonies of the atrocities they endured, only then did the neighboring Arab governments intervene with a ground invasion into Palestine. The new Jewish state, Israel, was able to ward off this invasion after a difficult struggle. It ended up taking over 77% of the land between the river and the sea. It also pushed up to 1 million Palestinians out of this territory and barred them from return under the pain of death. Their property was either taken or destroyed, their lands were appropriated. Up to 500 villages were erased from the map. Palestinians who remained in what became the State of Israel were subjected to emergency laws for 20 years, which allowed the State of Israel to control and gradually dispossess them. Already during the 1950s, the Israeli military drafted plans to take over the remaining 23% of the land, and in 1967, the Israeli military indeed took over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as other territories. The Palestinians of these 1967 territories were then put under martial law, which again was used and is still being used to control and dispossess them. To this day, they are being pushed into increasingly denser and confined centers of population, while more and more land is being appropriated both by the military as well as by fanatic neo-settlers. Now, the Palestinians never stopped resisting the expansion of Zionism. And it is true that this resistance has also taken the form of violence against Jewish civilians. Yet it's important to acknowledge the fact, a suppressed but well-documented fact, that ever since the militarization of Zionism in the late 1930s, its violence against Palestinians has been at least as indiscriminate and vastly more lethal and destructive. The only reason Palestinian guerrilla movements are labeled terror organizations, while the Israeli military is referred to as the Israeli Defense Forces, is that terrorist is simply the new word for savage. That's all it means. Just like the English colonizers in North America did with Native Americans, Zionist colonizers like to take the violence of the Palestinians out of its context. They don't see it for what it is. They don't see it as an inevitable symptom of an abusive relationship between colonizer and colonized. Rather, they see it as an expression of the murderous essence of a barbarian race of people. They see resistance as aggression, while conquest is seen as defense. Look, regardless of whom you believe the land belongs to, clearly the relationship between Zionists and Palestinians in the land between the river and the sea is settler-colonial in nature. Both the material and ideological aspects of this relationship are perfectly understandable without any reference to the religion or the culture of the Palestinians. Such a racist and essentialist approach to explaining the violence of the Palestinians is simply the attempt of the colonizer to disguise its own role as an oppressor. So, after having said all of this about Zionism as a colonial project, I would like to briefly address the question of decolonization. In Zionist society, which is heavily brainwashed, people are taught that decolonization necessarily means the reversal of everything that has occurred in the land in the past 100 years, which is to say, Zionists think of decolonization as the expulsion or even the extermination of the Jewish population in Palestine so as to re-establish an overwhelming Arab majority. Now, I don't find it surprising that some segments of Palestinian society do seem to fantasize about such a reversal of roles. It would be astonishing if such fantasies did not occur to an oppressed people. But for many Palestinians and non-Zionists in general, decolonization doesn't mean that at all. You see, if colonialism isn't about the question of whose land, but rather it is about an asymmetrical relationship between human groups, it means that decolonization simply means changing the nature of the relationship between Jews and Arabs, between the river and the sea. Two steps would have to take place. Firstly, Jews in Palestine must renounce the century-old project of redeeming the land, which means transferring resources from Arab to Jewish hands through intrigue, pressure, and violence. Notice that this minimal step towards peace has never occurred in the history of Zionism. Never. Although Zionist leaders may have spoken through the years about peace, there was never a single moment, not even during the Oslo Accords, where some land somewhere wasn't under some process of appropriation by Zionist institutions. And yet clearly, at the very minimum, the first step towards peace would have to be to stop threatening the property of Palestinians. But this would only be the first step. There would also have to be some kind of a redistribution of resources so as to allow everyone from the river to the sea to live a decent human life. Palestinians cannot remain confined in dense, poverty-stricken reservations. In short, decolonization would simply mean the end of Jewish supremacy in the distribution of land and power. It would mean freedom and equality for all, or some livable approximation of that ideal. It would mean democracy. As frightening as this sounds to Zionists, this is the only path to peace. This is the only alternative to the dystopian, grotesque nightmare that Zionism is becoming. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. My name is Dan Ben Ishai. Take care and be good.